Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday morning, and it's time to consider Australia's secret squirrel industry.
Of Edward Snowden, whistleblower or traitor, you be the judge, or the extraordinary goings-on over Australia, East Timor, arrests, The Hague, or at a common or garden level. All of us, the things we do online, on the phone, are being sampled, stored, quite possibly studied. If there's a common thread in all of this, it's probably accountability. Who spies in Australia? On whose orders? Who watches the watchers? Lots of questions there. I'm going to chew that over right now, and joining me in the studio to discuss all this, Dr Carl Ungerer. He's a security and strategic analyst, and up to September this year he was a senior advisor to Labor's Foreign Minister Bob Carr. He's former National Security Program Director at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and a former Senior Intelligence Analyst at the Office of National Assessments. Dr Clinton Fernandez is here too. He's an Australian academic, a former Australian Army officer who teaches at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and his research interest is the national interest in Australia's external relations. Dr Scott Birchall joins us too. He's a senior lecturer in international relations at Deakin University and a former political officer for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Welcome to you all. Carl, can I start with you? A lot of us don't know our ACEs from our Defence Signals Directorate. Can you give us a quick cook's tour of Australian intelligence agencies?
Well, sure, Jonathan. There are 6 principal agencies in what's called the Australian Intelligence Community, or the AIC, half divided between the Defence Department and non-defence agencies. They are, on the defence side, what was known as DSD, or Defence Signals Directorate, now known as the Australian Signals Directorate. DIGO, which is the Defence Imagery and Geospatial Organisation, and DIO, which is the Defence Intelligence Organisation, and they all sit under the Defence Minister's portfolio, those 3 agencies, and they're principally engaged in military intelligence. On the other side, there are 3 agencies in order of longevity. ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, which is our domestic national security agency. ASIS, which is the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, which has responsibilities for the collection of information overseas. And then sitting sometimes at the top, although it's been vague over the years, is the Office of National Assessments, which is meant to pull together all the information from all of those agencies and report to the Prime Minister and Cabinet their assessments on a whole range of issues, both political and economic, that informs government policy.
Okay, Clinton, introduce us to the role of the Inspector General of Intelligence Services.
The Inspector General of Intelligence and Security is located within the Department of the Prime Minister. Her role is to provide oversight of all the intelligence agencies. But there are key limitations on her role, as well as certain unique powers that she has. For example, her powers are akin to those of a Royal Commission. She can compel people to give evidence, compel the production of documents, and so on. The most important limitation is where the office is located. It's located in the executive branch itself. It's not some independent judicial review. It also has the ability just to look at, are the agencies following ministerial directions? Not whether those directions are right or wrong in some other sense. I mean, yes, there is the Intelligence Services Act, and a minister can give orders to spy on a particular country or to target a particular group of subversives or whoever. And provided those guidelines or the directives are in accordance with the Intelligence Services Act, all the IGIS can do is see whether the agencies are acting in accordance with those directives, not whether those directives are themselves moral or ethical in some other sense.
I mean, it's a fascinating relationship, and this is, I guess, what is interesting about the modern world, is the spillover of the gathering of intelligence into the sort of the common realm of everyday people's lives is one sort of interesting aspect. I mean, Scott, is that something that is covered by sufficient protection? Is there a hoovering going on of information?
Well, I think the capacity to do that has changed, and the digitisation of information, sometimes referred to as the digital age, has made the gathering of information, vast amounts of information, much more accessible to the intelligence services. It's not as technologically challenging as following people around and spying on them in person, and the temptations for those agencies to use surveillance, digital surveillance, is very high, given that governments want advance notice of the intentions and actions of their competitors and adversaries, and as well as the actions of people that they may be concerned about in the community. So what's changed, I think, is the nature of the intelligence and how it is gathered, and it's much more concentrated now in the electronic sphere than ever before, and that's because of digitisation.
And much more the scattergun, I guess, Carl, because of that as well. And the comparison that's often made is not looking for a needle in a haystack, but collecting the entire haystack and seeing if we can, within that, find the occasional needle. I mean, that then gives us a difficult problem of accountability and control and management, does it not?
Over the last 10 years, 15 years, you've seen the incredible growth in telecommunications, for smartphones, the sort of tablets we have around today, just everyday handheld communications that people now carry around with them weren't around 10 years ago. The whole social media revolution, which is also changing sort of some of the nature of the threats, because we know that terrorist groups in particular have used social media, still do. They have a very strong online presence. So this signals world in the last decade has got a lot messier, it's got a lot noisier, and Scott's right, our capacity to intercept some of this material has in fact grown commensurate with the level of the technology that's out there. So it does make accountability slightly more difficult, I would say, but I still think Australia has some of the strongest protections amongst the Five Eyes community for accountability and privacy, and we should be proud of those.
It was very interesting in the early 1990s when digital telephony came in. That is, we went from analogue mobile phones to digital mobile phones. When the three licenses were issued to Telstra, Optus and Vodafone, there was a period of delay. It was quite openly discussed in the technology parts of the newspapers. There was a delay while the telephony companies assured the intelligence services that the digital technology would not be encrypted to a level that they couldn't break. It was actually quite openly discussed that the Vodafone was not able to take up its license until they could reassure, presumably it was ASIO, that their communications could be monitored successfully by that agency. So it's not a surprise, it's not a secret as such, but perhaps the scale of it now is what really surprises people.
Clinton, I wonder whether that sort of supervisory regime has kept pace with that rate of change. I mean, there's been a shift in intelligence from agencies that sort of deal with combatants, if you like, that deal with participants in that sort of intelligence universe to some extent, to agencies having an oversight over or an interest in a far broader community of people. Has that environment of accountability kept pace with that change?
Many of the provisions in the Intelligence Services Act reflect a pre-World Wide Web, a pre-metadata era of regulation. But also on the question of accountability and oversight. In the United States, just to take comparisons, okay, in the United States there is a secret court called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISA court. It meets in secret, it hands down its decisions in secret. Nevertheless, it does constitute judicial oversight. It's located within the judicial branch of government. Australia doesn't have any judicial oversight. Okay. When it comes to legislative control, if you look at the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, which is what we've got, it's 11 members, 5 from one house, 6 from the other. It has specific prohibitions. It is forbidden under the law from investigating any operation, past, present, or proposed. It can't examine sources of information. can't examine operational methodologies. All it can do is examine the expenditure and administration of the agencies. And so if you were to compare the oversight regimes that prevail in Australia versus, say, what prevails in the United States or Germany, you find that we are not as good at overseeing as those countries. But you compare it to, say, the United Kingdom, we're basically on a par with them, in which the courts and the legislative branch are only minimally involved.
And I guess, Carl, why this is important is not to necessarily to ensure that we have an environment that can catch transgressions and when things go badly wrong, but more broadly to enforce a sense that the idea of national interest that the intelligence community might pursue is one that is shared by the broader community, is to maintain that sense of coincidence between those two things. Do you think that still applies? Are we both working in the same world?
Well, I think the intelligence agencies have to operate in a way that the public can have confidence that the work that they're doing is in the national interest, as you say. The best way they do that, of course, is in secrecy, because that is essentially how they can operate. The idea, and I respectfully take Clinton's point, but the idea that parliamentarians would have some oversight of sources and methods just scares the bejesus out of me, frankly. Look, I think there has to be public confidence. The fact was,
it's a huge public trust, is it not? I mean,
it is, but think about this. ASIS operated from 1952 to 1977 until it was formally acknowledged that it actually existed. And we've come a long way post, in the 9/11 decade in terms of putting these agencies onto a legislative footing, to ensuring that there is appropriate parliamentary and other oversight mechanisms in place. And I think the regime we've got now is pretty robust. I take Clinton's point, but I don't think we want to hold up the Americans as being the gold standard of accountability in intelligence oversight. I think that's a little bit of a stretch.
Intelligence and oversight is our subject. Sunday Extra, and guests are Dr. Carl Ungerer, Dr. Clinton Fernandez, and Dr. Scott Birchall. Scott, I mean, where this is, I think, where the Timor story of this week is kind of interesting, because here we have an example of intelligence work apparently conducted on our behalf, but which seems to serve not necessarily the national, but the commercial interest.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I wrote a book on the national interest and did a PhD, and one of the discarded chapters that never made it to print tried to find what the national interest actually was in Australian foreign policy, and trying to find a definition of it. And the only place I could find, in fact I couldn't find it ever written down, the only thing I could actually find was that in the Treasurer's Department, when there is a foreign takeover, the Foreign Investment Review Board is charged with protecting and enforcing the national interest. And when you drill down to figure out what that is, it's whatever the Treasurer says it is. So whenever you hear someone invoke the national interest, as Senator Brandis did in the Parliament a few days ago, it means whatever he wants it to mean, and it has no technical definition beyond whatever the politician of the day decides is the national interest, which is of course why it is used, because it's so flexible and elastic that you can say it, and it's one of those things that can't be proven one way or the other. You just, if you want to introduce a very unpopular consumption tax, as Mr. Howard did once, you say it's in the national interests, which of course implies that if you oppose it, you have something less than patriotic.
Isn't this, Carl Ungerer, we have something of a problem where essentially secretive activities coincide with a very flexible concept of national interest? We have something which becomes inherently rubbery.
Oh, Scott's absolutely right. The national interest is whatever the government of the day says it is. That said, I do think we have some broader national security interests in ensuring that terrorists do not seek to attack Australians or Australian interests, that we maintain territorial integrity, our sovereignty, our freedom act.
None of that was at risk in 2004 in East Timor.
No, and beyond that, we have some commercial interests, you know. Without going into the specifics of the case, you had large Australian companies who were deeply involved in, you know, those negotiations, and of course that there would have been a legitimate interest in knowing, you know, the direction and of those negotiations.
Is that a reasonable thing, Clinton? I mean, large Australian companies and their interests, does that become an issue of national interest?
They have the ability to influence how the national interest is understood and certainly how it's operationalized into policy, simply because of their dominant role in the economy. But I think that Carl's right on the question of needing to act independently as a country, maintain our sovereignty. There's some degree of objectivity to the concept of national interest, but in a very narrow sense. Okay, so basically, with the level of generality and abstraction that applies in the social sciences, you can still say that basically everyone in Australia, regardless of their income, their job, and so on, has a shared interest in not being invaded, okay, in not being attacked via, say, a terrorist attack. So there is a shared defense interest, which at least when it comes to self-defense, there is a national interest that everybody can sign up to. But when it comes to economic issues, that concept becomes very hard to justify because, you know, the interests of, say, a migrant worker who's cleaning a hotel room may be very different economically to the interests of the person who owns the hotel. And so at the economic level, it's harder to justify the concept of national interest that has to be protected by risking, even with the rest, the lives of Australian Secret Intelligence Service agents.
Well, let's take this discussion a little more globally before we close. And Carl, Edward Snowden we hear a lot of, and the Attorney General, Senator Brandis, this week said that his revelations are the most extraordinary thing to happen to Western intelligence since the Second World War. Does what he has done and the revelations that he is making and will continue to make, does that change the entire game of Western intelligence, and how?
No, it doesn't change the game at all. I think there will be some tightening of the distribution lists around some of the material so that a contractor who never finished high school can get his hands on this sort of material coming out of the NSA. It is extremely damaging, there's no doubt about it, where this sort of constant drip feed through the Guardian to, you know, sort of embarrass particular countries on material, frankly, none of which I've seen is in and of itself is a very sort of shocking piece of material, but it gets thrown up into the media and it has sort of classification on it and it all sounds very sexy, but it's none of what has been released so far you could say was a smoking gun that showed any malfeasance by any particular agency. So I don't think it changes anything in particular. I hope that Edward Snowden finds himself in a jail cell very soon and the materials that he has stolen get put back.
Does, Clinton, it change the nature of the relationship and the trust in the relationship between Australia and the United States?
Well, I mean, they're the ones that had the material stolen, not us. I mean, Australia kept our material very safe. But as to the change in the game, look, these revelations are extraordinary. If what is coming is the entirety of what Snowden has provided, then it kind of reveals the furniture, you know, of our intelligence assets. The government needs to show leadership on this. It needs to get together with the news agency, I think it's Guardian Australia, that has these materials, and sit down in a consistent, coherent pattern and agree as precisely and tell them why certain things ought not to be released, or face the specter of companies, news companies, simply releasing material based on their judgment. Because as long as the government simply issues threats about and condemnations about Snowden or anybody else, they aren't going to deal with the actual problem, which is that the horse is now out of the stable. It has bolted. And the only way back in now is to manage the problem by explaining precisely why certain technologies should not be revealed. Okay, because, for example, if we believe that we need to have a technological edge in our region because that allows us to have have a smaller defense budget, we don't need a large army, for example, if we've got good early warning of intelligence capabilities, under those circumstances, it's worth explaining that intelligence can provide a peace dividend because it means we have a good technological advantage in understanding threats in the region. Okay, well, in that case, certain technologies, encryption algorithms, things like that, I don't want to go into too much, should be explained by the government to the news companies, which gives them a sense of understanding why they should or should not, publish certain things.
It's a fascinating discussion, and I think it's one that will continue to play out in the months before us as revelations continue. And
Okay, well, I'm going to end this movie here, and then I'm going to record The Outsiders, and then I'm going to record First Dog on the Moon, and I will discuss this spy versus spy stuff at the conclusion of First Dog's offering for the week.